The morning of her wedding dawned with golden promise and a gown of Belgian lace that floated like a whispered prayer. Mountain pass breezes carried the scent of pine and lily as the small chapel bell tolled its eager silver invitation. Emmeline stood in the vestibule, her hands trembling with joy, her heart a cathedral of earnest and innocent hope. The groom, a high society banker's son, had sworn his eternal love beneath these very rafters not 2 months past. His family's carriage did not arrive, and the whispers among the guests began to coil like venomous serpents in pews. The organist played the bridal march a second time, the notes faltering with uncertainty as the hour grew painfully late. Rain began to pelt the stained glass with ferocity, a sudden mountain squall that mirrored the dread tightening her chest. A mud-splattered rider appeared not with the groom, but with a hastily scrawled note that she was unworthy of his name. The words struck her like a physical blow, the elegant calligraphy mocking every shared dream and every tenderly whispered promise. Abandoned at the altar, Emmeline turned and fled into the downpour, her lace train dragging through the thickening mire. Guests parted in awkward silence, their pity a second lashing that stripped her bare before she reached the chapel doors. She ran past the last homesteads, her pristine gown transformed into a shroud of heavy, clotted mud and torn silk. The mountain trail rose before her, slick and treacherous, but the wilderness demanded no explanation and offered no judgment. Deep in the shadow of the pines, she collapsed against a lightning-split oak and allowed the sobs to overtake her. The rain washed the salt from her face, but could not cleanse the stain of humiliation that branded her very soul. Hours passed, the storm slinking eastward, leaving a bruised purple sky and an exhausted woman draped in ruined tatters. She did not hear the approach of a horse until a low, respectful voice cut through the hollow ache of defeat. A man dismounted from a raw-boned roan, his silhouette hard against the clearing clouds, his eyes holding no pity. His name was Cade, a Wrangler known for breaking wild things, his own reputation as untamed as the mustangs he gentled. He offered no platitudes, only a leather canteen of water and a heavy wool blanket to ward off the creeping cold. Emmeline accepted, her fingers brushing his calloused palm, and something steady as granite passed silently between them. She whispered that she was utterly ruined, a laughingstock, a bride-made garbage before God and the entire valley. Cade stood quietly, then spoke with a voice like gravel smoothed by a patient river. Ruin was a liar's word. He told her she was not broken, merely standing in a mud puddle that a banker's son had poured beneath her feet. She looked up sharply, the first flicker of defiance reigniting in her chest at the gentle steel of his conviction. Then Cade did something no one expected. He whistled, a piercing note that seemed to command the very mountain. From the tree line emerged a horse that stole her breath, a colossal black stallion with eyes like burning obsidian. The stallion, named Tempest, was legendary for throwing every rider who dared to mount, rejecting all human mastery. Yet Cade led the beast forward, his hand resting on the velvet muzzle with a bond forged in mutual, fierce respect. He said the stallion had never been ridden by another soul, that something in Emmeline's grief called to him. Tempest lowered his massive head and blew a soft, warm breath directly into the tangled mess of her muddy hair. The gesture was so tender, so utterly unexpected, that a fresh wave of tears spilled from her swollen eyes. Cade explained that Tempest recognized authentic suffering, for the stallion had been beaten by a cruel hand before rescue. He removed his own saddle, settling it gently onto Tempest's back, the leather creaking a promise into the crisp air. Then Cade cupped his hands, offering her a leg up as if she were royalty ascending a throne of silver. Emmeline balked, the mud caked on her dress cracking, her shame a physical barrier to the impossible invitation. Cade's gaze held hers, unwavering, and he said a true queen rides through the mud, not around it. She placed her soiled slipper into his hands, and with a surge of newfound strength, she swung into the saddle. The moment her weight settled, Tempest did not buck or rear, but stood perfectly still, a mountain of coiled potential. She felt the stallion's heartbeat through the worn leather, a rhythm that synchronized with her own shattered but stubborn pulse. Cade mounted his roan and simply nodded east, toward the open plains where the sky swallowed every human frailty. They walked the horses through the forest's edge, the silence no longer empty but filled with an electric, living anticipation. When the tree line broke, revealing a vast sea of rain-washed prairie grass glittering under the returning sun, she gasped. Cade nudged his roan into a trot, and without a command, Tempest matched the gait as if reading Emmeline's mind. She gripped the horn, knuckles white, but the stallion's movement was impossibly smooth, a cradle of rhythmic, untamed grace. Cade suddenly spurred into a gallop, and Tempest's response was a surge of pure, explosive power that stole her scream. The scream turned into startled laughter, a sound she had forgotten she possessed, as the wind scoured away her disgrace. Mud flew from her ruined dress in dark arcs, the heavy filth sloughing off like a discarded second skin of sorrow. Tempest's mane whipped her cheeks, and she leaned forward, her body finding an instinctive harmony with the beast's every stride. They thundered across the open range, the stallion and the abandoned bride, two untamable spirits finally granted their release. Cade watched from her eyes, a rare smile cracking his weathered face, knowing he had played the right gamble. They rode for miles until the sun bled orange into the horizon, and Tempest slowed to a contented, patient walk. Emmeline slid from the saddle at a crystal stream, her legs shaky but her spine straight as a young pine. She cupped water and drank, then looked at her reflection, a wild-haired woman wearing mud as a warrior's paint. Cade joined her, leading both horses to drink, and said she had ridden the unrideable, a feat no man accomplished. She replied that Tempest did not need taming, only someone who understood the terror of being trapped by a name. That night, they camped under a canopy of uncountable stars, a small fire pushing back the darkness of her past. Cade shared jerky and hardtack, never prying, his presence a silent fortress that required no siege to prove its strength. Emmeline unpinned the remnants of her veil and fed the tattered lace to the flames, watching her old self burn. In the flickering light, she saw not a discarded bride, but a woman being forged anew in a wilderness crucible. She asked Cade why he had offered his best stallion to a stranger humiliated in the mud of a mountain. He stared into the fire for a long while, and then admitted he recognized a captive heart when he saw one. Years ago, he had been the one left in chains, sold out by kin, finding redemption only through the horses he saved. Tempest, he explained, had been beaten by a proud man who wanted to crush his spirit, but only ignited a fire. The stallion never bowed, and Cade swore never to break a horse, only to help them remember how to run again. He saw the same fierce, buried light in Emmeline when she wept against the oak, her spirit bruised but not extinguished. She absorbed his words, feeling them settle into the hollow places the groom's betrayal had carved with a coward's chisel. Dawn came crisp and golden, and Emmeline rose with a decision crystallized in the marrow of her bones. She would ride Tempest back into that town, not as a victim but as a woman crowned by her own survival. Cade offered his duster to cover her ruined dress, but she refused, declaring the mud was now her royal ermine. They rode at a steady pace, the stallion's hooves drumming a triumphant march against the hard-packed earth of the main road. The town, still buzzing with scandal, fell into a shocked hush as the bizarre procession appeared on the dusty horizon. Women gasped, men removed their hats, and children pointed at the wild-eyed bride astride the untamable black demon stallion. Emmeline guided Tempest directly to the bank where her former groom Charles stood on the boardwalk, his jaw slack. She reined the great horse to a halt, looming over him, her mud-stiffened dress a battle standard of her ordeal. Charles stammered about reputation and family expectations, his excuses crumbling into pathetic dust under her silent, regal glare. She did not shout, merely stated that he had broken a promise but had inadvertently given her a kingdom of freedom. Tempest tossed his head and snorted, and Charles stumbled backward into a water trough, drenched and utterly defeated. The crowd's scandalized whispers transformed into a murmur of awed respect, the mockery now buried under her triumph. Emmeline turned Tempest toward the chapel where she had been shamed, and she kissed its gate with a forgiving hand. She then rode to the livery where Cade worked, dismounting with the fluid grace of a woman reborn in the saddle. Cade stood in the doorway, his hat low, but his eyes held a warmth that was not solely for the stallion. She told him she needed a job, not a charity, and she would work to earn Tempest's keep for the rest of her days. Cade nodded slowly, a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth, and handed her a brush to groom the stallion. The days that followed were filled with the honest labor of mucking stalls, mending tack, and training young colts. Emmeline's hands grew calloused, her skin bronzed, and the last traces of the pampered banker's fiancé faded into a ghost. Tempest remained solely hers, the bond deepening into a language of subtle shifts in weight and whispered breath against his ear. Cade taught her everything about horseflesh, and in turn, she taught him that a woman's gentleness was not weakness. They became partners, two outcasts building a reputation for taking the most damaged horses and restoring their will to run. Charles eventually married another heiress, but the story of his humiliation by the muddy bride persisted as a cautionary tale. One autumn evening, as they rode together under a copper moon, Cade reined in his roan and cleared his throat. He spoke haltingly, a man more comfortable with beasts than declarations, and confessed his admiration had grown into something deeper. Emmeline smiled, the first truly peaceful smile since the storm, and replied that she had known since the blanket. She told him she had felt his respect on that mountain before she even understood the shape of her own worth. They did not rush, but the courtship unfolded as naturally as the seasons, a slow and steady building of trust. Cade would leave wildflowers on her saddle, and she would mend the tears in his coats with careful, loving stitches. Tempest would nudge them together when they stood too far apart, the stallion now playing a cheeky, four-legged Cupid. The town stopped whispering about the ruined bride and began speaking of the horsewoman who commanded the legendary Tempest without reins. Ranchers from counties oversaw her skill, and Emmeline trained their rogue mounts with a quiet, empathetic authority. On the first anniversary of the jilting, Cade led her to the stream where she had first seen her reflection. He knelt in the same mud that had once defined her shame and asked her to be his wife, his partner, his everything. Emmeline pulled him up, laughing, and said she would marry him right there, in this very spot, with Tempest as witness. The ceremony happened a month later, a small gathering on the open prairie with a traveling preacher and a handful of friends. Emmeline wore a simple white dress, unadorned, its hem brushing the wildflowers, her feet bare in the cool grass. Tempest stood as her honor guard, a garland of mountain laurel woven into his mane, his eyes bright with knowing. Cade wore a clean vest and the same dusty hat, his vows as sturdy as the rock outcroppings that sheltered their valley. She promised to ride beside him through every storm, never again to be a bride abandoned to any kind of mud. He promised to offer her his best always, not as charity but as recognition of the queen she had always been. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Tempest whinnied a loud, joyful cry that echoed across the plains. The guests cheered, and Emmeline flung her bouquet into the crowd, a young ranch girl catching it with a squeal. That night, around a bonfire, Cade played a harmonica, a simple, haunting tune that spoke of trails and homecoming. Emmeline leaned against Tempest's shoulder, the stallion's warmth, a familiar comfort, and watched the flames dance with her husband. She realized her wedding dress had been muddy rags, but the filth had been the very soil from which her true life bloomed. The Wrangler had shared his best stallion, and in doing so, had given her the reins to her own unbreakable soul. Years later, their children would hear the story, not of shame, but of how their mother rode a legend to freedom. The black stallion lived to a venerable age, and when he passed, A piece of the prairie wind went with him. They buried Tempest on the rise where he first galloped with Emmeline, a cairn of stones marking his sacred ground. By then, the ranch had grown, a haven for misfits, both human and equine, all learning to run their own path. Cade grew old with Emmeline, their love a testament that the finest things are often forged in the deepest mires. She never forgot the humiliation, but it became the cornerstone of a gratitude so profound that it healed everyone around her. Emmeline would often tell the young women who came to learn riding that a ruined dress is just a chrysalis. The butterfly is forged in the struggle, and no one can truly humiliate a soul that knows its own untamed worth. She spoke of a stoic Wrangler who saw a queen beneath the mud and offered not pity but a stallion's trust. And every time she recounted the tale, she would point to the horizon, where a dark horse seemed forever galloping. Her message was simple: when the world leaves you caked in disgrace, find a beast that recognizes your silent grief. Ride it without apology, and you will gallop right out of the ashes of your old life into a dazzling majesty. If this story stirred your heart, please subscribe to Western Tales Official and like this video to champion the broken. Tell us in the comments what moment transformed your deepest pain into an unexpected crown of victory and self-love. We believe every abandoned bride, every outcast, carries a stallion spirit waiting for the right wrangler to simply believe. Until our next tale, remember that mud is just the starting line, and the wild ride always leads to glory.